Before we start, close your eye. Your brain will create all the visual. Let's start. Most of us believe our homes are safe, not because we've tested them, but because we need to believe it. A home is where we shut the door on the world, where we take off our shoes, where we sleep without watching our backs, a place where nothing is supposed to follow us. But think about this for a moment. How much do you really know about the place you live in? Who stood in those rooms before you? What they whispered? What they feared? What they did when no one was watching? Most of the time, we don't ask, because asking would make us uncomfortable. And discomfort is something we try very hard to avoid inside our own homes. That's how this story begins. Not with ghosts, not with demons, not with screams in the night. It begins with a family looking for a house, a normal family, a good deal, a place that felt almost too perfect. And that's exactly why it worked. Welcome to DarkStory Lab. This is Jake, and tonight, we're stepping into one of the most infamous houses in American history, a place where nothing chased its victims, nothing needed to. This is the true story of the Amityville Horror. In December of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz were newly married. Between them, they had 3 children. They were starting over, blending a family, looking for stability. They found a house in Amityville, New York, large, beautiful, right on the water. The price didn't make sense. It was far lower than it should have been. The real estate agent eventually told them why. Just over a year earlier, 6 members of the DeFeo family had been murdered inside that house, shot in their beds, one by one. No signs of struggle, no neighbors hearing anything. Their son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., was convicted of the crime. Most people would have walked away. The Lutz family didn't. They believed in fresh starts. They believed a house was just a house. They believed evil didn't linger in walls and floors. And most of all, they believed they could handle it. On December 18th, 1975, the Lutz family moved in. They didn't last a month. From the very first night, things felt wrong, not terrifying. Wrong. Cold spots in warm rooms, doors that wouldn't stay shut, a sense of being watched when the house was quiet. George Lutz began waking up at exactly 3:15 a.m. every night, the same time the DeFeo murders were believed to have occurred. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Coincidences don't repeat themselves. Kathy began having vivid nightmares. The children talked to invisible companions. One described a pig-like creature with glowing eyes that watched them from outside the house. The house itself seemed to change. Walls felt colder. Rooms smelled foul without explanation. Black residue oozed from keyholes and walls. A priest attempting to bless the house claimed a voice screamed at him to leave. The Lutz family grew weaker, exhausted, paranoid, isolated. George became distant, angry, obsessed with the house. He stopped shaving, stopped caring, spent hours staring into the fireplace, unmoving. Kathy felt something following her through the rooms, not chasing, waiting. On January 14th, 1976, after only 28 days, the Lutz family fled the house in the middle of the night. They left everything behind. Clothes, furniture, food still on the table. They never returned. What happened inside that house has been debated for decades. Some say it was a hoax. Some say it was exaggerated. Some say nothing supernatural ever occurred. But here's the part that never goes away. The fear didn't start with the Lutz family. It started before them. And it didn't end when they left. Because the Amityville house didn't need belief. It needed presence. And once someone lived there, it didn't let them go easily. I'm going to pause right here, because from this point forward, the story goes much deeper. Into the DeFeo murders themselves, psychological patterns, inconsistencies, witnesses, and why the house became something larger than the people inside it. To understand what happened to the Lutz family, you have to go back before they ever stepped inside the house. Because the house on Ocean Avenue didn't begin with ghosts. It began with violence. On the night of November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family while they slept. His parents and 4 siblings were found face down in their beds, each killed with a shotgun blast. What disturbed investigators most wasn't just the brutality, it was the silence. Neighbors heard nothing. No screams, no struggle, no attempt to escape. 6 people were killed in the same house, one after another, and not a single one woke the others. That detail has never sat comfortably with anyone who studied the case. Ronald DeFeo Jr. gave multiple conflicting confessions. At times he claimed he acted alone. At other times, he said he heard voices telling him to do it. Later, he insisted someone else was involved. His story shifted constantly. But one thing remained consistent. He said the house spoke to him, not in a dramatic way, not with commands shouted from the walls, in whispers. Investigators dismissed this as an excuse, a way to avoid responsibility. And legally, that's exactly how it was treated. But psychologically, the detail mattered. Because people who fabricate stories often exaggerate. DeFeo minimized. He didn't describe terror. He described pressure, an overwhelming sense that something wanted him to act. That sense of pressure is something the Lutz family would later describe almost word for word. When George Lutz first began waking up at 3:15 a.m., he didn't feel afraid. He felt alert, as if his body was responding to something it couldn't explain. Night after night, the same time. 3:15 a.m. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels intentional. George would walk through the rooms, checking doors and windows, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, even though nothing appeared out of place. That's how the house worked. It didn't present threats. It created unease. Kathy noticed it too. She felt colder than usual, even when the heat was on. She felt watched in rooms where no one else was present. The children began changing. One of them started speaking to an imaginary friend they called Jody. They described Jody as a large pig with glowing red eyes. George and Kathy tried to laugh it off. Children imagine things. But Jody didn't feel like imagination. The children described Jody knowing things they shouldn't know. Things about the house. Things about the past. The house itself began reacting. Doors slammed without drafts. Windows opened on their own. Strange odors filled rooms and vanished suddenly. The Lutz family wasn't religious fanatics. They weren't looking for demons. They wanted normal. And that's what made it harder. Because nothing they experienced felt dramatic enough to justify panic. It felt cumulative, like pressure building behind the walls. A priest named Father Pecoraro attempted to bless the house shortly after the Lutz family moved in. While performing the blessing, he claimed to hear a male voice shout, "Get out!" Not whisper, not suggest, command. After that visit, the priest fell ill with blisters forming on his hands, similar to burns. He never returned to the house. George grew more withdrawn. He stopped sleeping properly. He became irritable. He spent hours staring at the fireplace, chopping wood obsessively even when it wasn't needed. The house seemed to center on him, not because he was weak, because he was present. George was home more than anyone else. He felt responsible for the house, responsible for keeping the family safe inside it. That responsibility weighed on him, and the house seemed to notice. Kathy felt something following her through the rooms. Not footsteps, not shadows. Awareness. She described the sensation of turning corners and feeling like someone had already been there, waiting. At one point, she claimed levitation during sleep. rising from the bed and floating toward the ceiling before waking in terror. Skeptics dismiss this as sleep paralysis or stress-induced hallucination. That explanation doesn't account for the children reporting similar disturbances independently. The house was not selective. It affected everyone differently. The Lutz family lasted 28 days. On January 14th, 1976, they fled. They didn't pack. They didn't plan. They ran. And here's the detail that rarely gets attention. They didn't flee because of one final terrifying event. They fled because they believed staying would end them. Not physically. Mentally. They felt the house was wearing them down. And that idea, erosion rather than attack, is what makes the Amityville Horror so difficult to dismiss. Because erosion doesn't leave clean evidence, it leaves patterns. And patterns are exactly what followed. After the Lutz family fled the house, they expected relief. They didn't get it. For weeks afterward, George and Kathy reported lingering anxiety, vivid dreams, and an overwhelming need to stay together in the same room. The sense of pressure followed them, not as a presence, but as an afterimage. Like staring into a bright light and still seeing it when you close your eyes. They tried to tell their story quietly at first, but the house wouldn't stay quiet. Reporters came. Investigators followed. Skeptics arrived with notebooks and theories. Paranormal researchers brought equipment. Psychologists offered explanations. The story fractured immediately. Some people believed the Lutz family completely. Others accused them of exaggeration, fabrication, or outright fraud. The accusations hurt, but what troubled the Lutz family more was how familiar the pattern felt. The more the house was discussed, the more it seemed to press back into their lives. George noticed that whenever he spoke about certain rooms, certain smells, certain times of night, his body reacted the same way it had in the house. Tight chest, shallow breathing, irritation that came without cause. It was as if the story itself carried residue. Meanwhile, investigators returned to the house on Ocean Avenue. And something unexpected happened. Nothing. The dramatic phenomena described by the Lutz family didn't repeat on command. The house remained still. Quiet. Almost cooperative. That absence became the skeptics' strongest argument. They pointed out inconsistencies in timelines, contradictions between interviews, financial motives tied to book deals, psychological stressors that could explain shared hallucinations. On paper, the hoax theory made sense. But there was a problem. The house didn't behave like a stage. Places that are fabricated tend to overperform. They produce spectacle. They reward attention. The Amityville house did the opposite. It withdrew. That withdrawal confused investigators who expected escalation. Those who stayed overnight often reported nothing unusual at all. Others experienced subtle discomfort they couldn't articulate, restlessness, difficulty sleeping, the sense that time felt distorted. No jump scares, no apparitions, just unease, which is far harder to fake. One team of investigators noted that activity, when it did occur, was more likely when the house was occupied by people attempting to live normally rather than observe it. When they unpacked, when they cooked meals, when they settled into routines, observation didn't provoke the house. Presence did. This distinction became clearer when new families moved into the home. Life continued on Ocean Avenue. Different owners came and went over the years. Some reported nothing. Others reported experiences eerily similar to the Lutz families, though rarely as intense. The most common reports involved disturbed sleep, feelings of being watched, and sudden emotional shifts without clear cause. No one ever stayed just long enough to be destroyed, but no one stayed long enough to feel untouched. That inconsistency fueled debate. Skeptics argued that the notoriety of the house influenced perception, that people arrived primed to feel something, That explanation doesn't account for children experiencing things before being told the history, or pets reacting to empty spaces, or neighbors reporting strange sounds years before the Lutz family ever arrived. And it doesn't explain Ronald DeFeo Jr. DeFeo continued to insist that voices influenced him, that the house had an effect. His claims were dismissed legally, and rightly so. But psychiatrists noted something odd. His descriptions lacked theatricality. He didn't describe demons. He described pressure, a sense of inevitability. That sense of inevitability mirrors what the Lutz family described, what later residents hinted at, what investigators felt but couldn't capture. The house didn't create madness. It amplified what already existed. Stress became obsession. Responsibility became fixation. Thought became rumination. The Amityville house seemed to reward attention with more attention, not fear. Focus. And focus is exhausting. That exhaustion is what broke the Lutz family. Not one event. Not one night. A slow wearing down. The realization that the house demanded awareness at all times. And humans aren't built for that. We need places where we can relax our minds. The Amityville house didn't allow that. Even when nothing happened, something felt unfinished. As if the house was waiting for you to slip. That's why the Lutz family ran. Not from terror, from erosion. As the Amityville story spread, it began to change shape. Not because the house changed, but because people did. Once the book was published, and the case entered popular culture, the house on Ocean Avenue stopped being just a place. It became a symbol. A shorthand for something people already feared, but couldn't quite explain. That transformation mattered, because symbols don't stay contained. They move. They gather meaning far beyond their original form. Psychologists studying the Amityville case pointed out something uncomfortable. The house didn't create a single, consistent supernatural narrative. Instead, it absorbed whatever framework people brought with them. To some, it was demonic. To others, psychological. To others, a tragic coincidence magnified by stress and suggestion. But no matter the interpretation, the emotional experience followed the same pattern. Heightened awareness, disrupted sleep, intrusive thoughts, a sense of pressure that never fully released. Those symptoms don't require ghosts. They require an environment that keeps the mind from resting. The Amityville house did that remarkably well. Researchers began focusing less on paranormal explanations and more on environmental psychology. How space, light, sound, and history affect perception. The house was large, isolated, and asymmetrical. Long hallways, narrow staircases, windows positioned in a way that created shadows at night. A river behind the house that reflected light in unpredictable patterns. Even without history, it was a house that encouraged vigilance. Add the knowledge of a mass murder, and vigilance becomes obsession. But that explanation still left gaps. Why 3:15 a.m.? Why the shared experiences among children? Why did multiple investigators report discomfort, even when trying to remain detached? Why did the house seem to withdraw when challenged and become more present when ignored? These inconsistencies frustrated skeptics and believers alike. The truth sat somewhere in between. The Amityville house didn't need to prove anything. It simply existed. And existence, when paired with attention, creates meaning. Over time, George and Kathy Lutz grew weary of defending themselves. They weren't interested in convincing anyone anymore. They were interested in surviving what came after. George admitted years later that the hardest part wasn't the house. It was trying to explain an experience that didn't have sharp edges. People expect horror to be dramatic, to be loud, to leave clear evidence. But the Amityville experience was dull in the most dangerous way. Dull like constant tension. dull like sleepless nights, dull like never feeling fully alone. Those experiences are easy to dismiss individually, but together, they wear people down. That's why the house never needed to escalate. It let time do the work. As the years passed, the Amityville house continued to attract attention. Tourists stopped by. People took photos. Some taunted it. Some prayed. Most felt nothing. A few felt something they couldn't explain. The house never responded the same way twice. That unpredictability became part of its reputation. Not a haunted house, an uncomfortable one. And uncomfortable things linger in the mind longer than terrifying ones. Children who lived in the house later described dreams they didn't understand at the time. Dreams of watching, dreams of waiting, dreams where the house felt awake. Animals behaved strangely at times. Dogs refusing certain rooms, cats staring at walls for extended periods. Again, nothing dramatic, just enough to unsettle. That phrase comes up often in the Amityville story. Just enough. Enough to disturb sleep. Enough to alter behavior. Enough to make people question their own reactions. But never enough to force belief. That balance is what allowed the house to remain controversial for decades. If it had been clearly supernatural, it would have been dismissed by science. If it had been clearly mundane, it would have faded into obscurity. Instead, it occupied the space in between. And that space is powerful, because it invites interpretation. And interpretation keeps stories alive. The Amityville house doesn't demand belief. It tolerates doubt. It doesn't chase people. It lets them stay just long enough to feel unsettled. And then it lets them leave. Because leaving doesn't end the story. Leaving begins it. As the years went on, the Amityville house became less about what happened inside it and more about what it represented. It became a measuring stick. Whenever a new haunting was reported somewhere else, people compared it to Amityville. Whenever a family fled a home claiming fear and exhaustion, the same question surfaced. Was it another Amityville? That comparison changed how people experienced fear itself. It gave shape to something that was previously vague. It taught people what to look for. And that is where the story took a turn that few expected. Because once people knew what to look for, they began finding it everywhere. Sleep disturbances, unexplained anxiety, the sense of being watched in familiar spaces. These experiences were not new to humanity. They had always existed. But Amityville gave them a narrative. It told people that a house could be responsible. That shift mattered. When fear has no source, it feels internal, personal, something you can work through. When fear has an address, it becomes external, and external fear is easier to talk about. That's why the Amityville Horror spread so quickly. It gave people language for something they already felt, but couldn't name. Psychologists studying the case noted that once a haunting narrative enters public consciousness, it reshapes how people interpret stress. Normal sensations, creaking sounds, drafts, shadows, take on new meaning. But meaning alone doesn't explain the exhaustion described by the Lutz family. Meaning doesn't explain why George Lutz felt compelled to sit alone for hours, staring into nothing. Why Kathy felt drained even when she slept. Why the children withdrew into themselves. Those effects suggest something more sustained, something environmental. The Amityville house sat beside water. The canal behind it reflected moonlight into the house at night, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Sounds carried oddly across the surface. The isolation amplified small noises. Those physical factors alone could disrupt sleep. But disruption doesn't explain obsession. It doesn't explain the fixation George developed on the house itself, on protecting it, on maintaining it. People under stress often cling to control. George clung to the house. That relationship is important. The house didn't dominate him. It became the center of his attention. Attention narrows perspective. Narrowed perspective feeds stress. Stress deepens fixation. That loop can feel external, like something else is guiding it. The Amityville Horror may not have been a story about possession. It may have been a story about attention being slowly redirected until nothing else fit. The house didn't isolate the Lutz family physically. It isolated them mentally. Friends noticed changes. George became irritable. Kathy withdrew. The children became quieter. Isolation is a powerful catalyst. Once a family begins turning inward, small problems grow unchecked. Fear feeds on itself. But here's the detail skeptics still struggle with. Why did the same pattern appear in other residents? Why did later occupants report unease even without dramatic events? Why did some families leave after short stays without being able to explain why? They often said the same thing. The house felt heavy, not oppressive. Heavy, as if it required effort just to exist inside it. That sensation didn't always appear immediately. It built over time. Days. Weeks. The house didn't frighten people into leaving. It tired them. And tired people make different decisions than rested ones. They misinterpret signals. They assume worst-case scenarios. They lose perspective. That's why erosion is more dangerous than attack. An attack provokes defense. Erosion wears defense down quietly. The Amityville house never needed to force anyone out. It simply made staying harder than leaving. That's a subtle power, one that doesn't leave fingerprints. And that subtlety is why the story persists. Because nothing about Amityville can be conclusively disproven or proven. The house exists. The murders happened. The Lutz family fled. Everything else sits in the gray space between interpretation and experience. That gray space is where stories survive. The Amityville Horror didn't end when the Lutz family left. It ended when people stopped asking what happened and started asking why it still mattered. And the answer is uncomfortable, because the story isn't really about a haunted house. It's about what happens when a place becomes the focus of sustained attention. When fear, curiosity, stress, and belief converge long enough to shape experience. The house didn't need to change. People did. As time passed, the Amityville Horror began to lose something essential. Not relevance, urgency. The more the story was debated, analyzed, and commercialized, the more it drifted away from the quiet reality at its center. Movies exaggerated it. Books dramatized it. Arguments hardened into sides. Believers on one end, skeptics on the other. And somewhere in between, the actual experience was buried. Because the real Amityville story was never about levitation or demonic voices echoing through halls. Those details came later, shaped by retellings and expectations. The original experience, stripped of embellishment, was simpler. A family moved into a house carrying the weight of violence. They stayed long enough for that weight to settle. They grew exhausted, isolated, and mentally strained. They left before they broke completely. That's not cinematic, but it's real. And reality is often harder to dismiss than spectacle. When researchers revisited the case decades later, they noticed something telling. Many of the most extreme claims appeared only after the family had left the house and begun recounting the experience repeatedly. Memory isn't static. It reshapes itself each time it's revisited. Fear sharpens details. Stress fills in gaps. Expectation rewrites uncertainty. That doesn't mean the experience was false. It means it evolved, the same way the house itself seemed to do. Each retelling layered something new onto the story. Each debate added pressure. Each adaptation pulled the narrative further from the quiet, grinding unease that defined the original weeks on Ocean Avenue. Yet despite all the noise, one truth remained unchanged. The house was unbearable to live in, not because of what happened, because of how it felt. And feeling is something science struggles to measure. Environmental psychologists explain that humans are deeply sensitive to context. Light, sound, history, and expectation combine to influence mood in powerful ways. A place associated with violence carries an invisible burden. Even when people consciously dismiss it, the mind keeps track. That burden doesn't need to manifest as fear. It manifests as vigilance. And vigilance is exhausting. The Lutz family lived in a state of constant low-level alertness, not panic, not terror. Awareness. Every sound mattered. Every shadow required explanation. Every odd sensation demanded interpretation. That constant mental activity eroded their sense of safety. A home stopped feeling like a refuge. And once a home loses that role, everything else collapses. Sleep suffers. Patience wears thin. Relationships strain. That's the real horror of Amityville. Not the supernatural claims. The breakdown of what a home is supposed to be. Later, families moved in and out of the house. Some stayed for years. Others left quickly. Their experiences varied widely, but nearly all of them agreed on one thing. The house felt different. Not cursed. Different. That difference is difficult to define because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, and people respond to it in their own ways. Some ignore it and adapt. Some internalize it and struggle. Some leave before it takes hold. The Amityville house never forced outcomes. It offered conditions. And conditions shape behavior more effectively than threats ever could. That's why the story still resonates decades later. Because it isn't about belief. It's about environment. It's about how spaces influence us quietly, over time, without permission. The house on Ocean Avenue didn't need to scare people. It needed them to stay long enough. Long enough for routine to form. Long enough for vigilance to become habit. Long enough for exhaustion to blur judgment. That's when people stop trusting themselves. And when you stop trusting yourself, fear doesn't need a face. It lives everywhere. The Amityville Horror is often remembered as a story of demons and possession. But that interpretation misses the deeper warning. The real danger wasn't what entered the house. It was what the house took away. Rest, perspective, a sense of safety. Those losses don't leave dramatic evidence. They leave people tired, confused, and desperate to escape. And desperation doesn't care whether the threat is real or imagined. It just wants out. That's why the Lutz family ran. Not because they were chased, because staying felt impossible. And that quiet impossibility is what still unsettles people who study the case honestly, because it suggests something uncomfortable. That a place doesn't need to be haunted to be harmful. It only needs to erode you slowly enough that you don't realize what you're losing until it's almost gone. When people look back at the Amityville Horror now, decades later, they often search for a verdict. Was it real? Was it fake? Was it exaggerated? Was it psychological? But the need for a verdict misses the point. Stories like Amityville don't survive because they're proven. They survive because they resonate. And Amityville resonates because it touches something uncomfortably familiar. The idea that a place can wear you down. Not suddenly, not violently, but patiently. The house on Ocean Avenue didn't announce itself as dangerous. It didn't warn the Lutz family to leave. It didn't escalate to force a reaction. It simply remained what it was. and that constancy became unbearable. That's what separates Amityville from fiction. In most horror stories, the threat reveals itself. There's a moment of clarity when the danger becomes undeniable. Amityville never gave that moment. Every experience could be questioned. Every sensation could be explained away. Every fear could be labeled stress or imagination. But explanations didn't make the feeling stop. And that's what trapped the family. They were caught between doubt and dread, too uncertain to flee immediately, too exhausted to stay indefinitely. That limbo is where fear does its best work. Over time, the Lutz family stopped asking whether something was wrong with the house and started asking what was wrong with them. That shift is devastating, because when fear turns inward, people lose their footing. George questioned his sanity. Kathy questioned her instincts. The children withdrew, sensing something the adults couldn't articulate. That breakdown of trust between people and themselves is far more destructive than any ghost story. And it didn't begin with the Lutz family. Ronald DeFeo Jr., regardless of his guilt, described a similar internal pressure, a sense of being overwhelmed by something he couldn't control or escape. Investigators dismissed it as manipulation, but manipulation usually seeks attention. DeFeo's descriptions were flat, unemotional, almost resigned. That resignation echoes through the Amityville story again and again. People don't panic in that house. They give up. They stop fighting the feeling and start adapting to it. That adaptation looks like obsession, withdrawal, irritability, fixation, not madness. Fatigue. Fatigue changes people quietly. It lowers tolerance. It narrows perspective. It makes extreme choices feel reasonable. Leaving everything behind in the middle of the night becomes logical when staying feels heavier than starting over. The Amityville Horror endures because it never offers a clean explanation. It resists closure. And humans crave closure. When we don't get it, we keep returning to the story, hoping the next angle will finally make sense of it. But Amityville doesn't want to be solved. It wants to be considered. It wants to sit in the back of your mind as a reminder that fear doesn't always come from the unknown. Sometimes it comes from the familiar, from a home that stops feeling safe, from walls that feel closer each day, from nights that never fully rest you. That kind of fear doesn't look dramatic. It looks domestic. And that's why it's so effective, because when the place you rely on for comfort becomes a source of tension, there's nowhere left to retreat. The Amityville house didn't chase its occupants. It removed their refuge. And once that happens, everything else follows. That's why the story still unsettles people who've never seen the house, never read the book, never watched the films. Because everyone understands what it means to feel uneasy in a place that should feel safe. Everyone understands exhaustion. Everyone understands the quiet panic of realizing you can't relax where you're supposed to. The Amityville Horror is not a story about believing in ghosts. It's a story about what happens when certainty dissolves slowly, when doubt and fear overlap just enough to keep you from trusting your own judgment, when leaving feels drastic, but staying feels impossible. That space between action and paralysis is where Amityville lives, and that's why it never really ends. Because that space exists everywhere, in any home where tension goes unspoken, in any place where stress lingers long enough to feel permanent, in any environment that wears people down without ever raising its voice. The house on Ocean Avenue became famous because it gave that feeling a name. And once something has a name, it becomes harder to ignore. In the end, the Amityville house did exactly what it always did. It stayed. People argued, books were written, movies were made, experts debated, skeptics dismantled claims piece by piece. Believers clung tighter to their interpretations, and through all of it, the house on Ocean Avenue remained unchanged. New owners repainted the walls, renovated rooms, altered the windows so the house would be less recognizable, tried to erase its identity. But identity isn't built from appearances. It's built from memory. And memory doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Families continued to live there. Children grew up. Daily life went on. Most reported nothing unusual. Some reported subtle discomfort they couldn't explain. Others said the house felt ordinary. All of those accounts can be true at the same time. Because the Amityville house never promised an experience. It offered a condition. Live here long enough, and you will notice yourself more. Your stress, your habits, your thoughts at night when the house is quiet. Some people welcome that awareness. Others break under it. The house doesn't choose. It reflects. That reflection is why Amityville refuses to fade into history like other famous cases. There's no clear lesson, no monster to defeat, no ritual to perform. Just a question that lingers longer than it should. What happens when the place meant to protect you becomes the thing you can't relax inside? That question is uncomfortable because it doesn't belong to one house. It belongs everywhere. The Amityville Horror endures because it strips away the fantasy of haunted houses and leaves behind something more unsettling. The possibility that fear doesn't need to come from the supernatural. It can come from exhaustion, from isolation, from the slow erosion of safety. That kind of fear doesn't announce itself. It builds. And once it does, people don't run screaming. They quietly give up on staying. The Lutz family didn't escape a demon. They escaped a place that was slowly hollowing them out. Whether the cause was psychological, environmental, or something no one has named, yet almost doesn't matter. The outcome was the same. They lost their home. And losing your home, emotionally, mentally, is one of the most destabilizing experiences a person can have. That's the real legacy of Amityville, not proof of the paranormal. A warning that homes are more than walls and roofs. They are systems. They hold routines, emotions, histories. And when those systems become unbalanced, people feel it long before they can explain it. The house on Ocean Avenue became famous because it exposed that truth. It showed how thin the line is between comfort and unease, how easily safety can erode when rest disappears, how quickly people will doubt themselves when the place they trust stops feeling trustworthy. That's why Amityville still matters, not because of ghosts, but because everyone understands what it means to want to leave a place that's supposed to feel like home. And that understanding lingers far longer than any story about demons ever could. If this story unsettled you, not because of what you heard, but because of what it made you think about, that's the kind of horror we explore here. At DarkStory Lab, we don't chase loud fear. We tell stories rooted in real places, real people, and the quiet moments where fear doesn't need to announce itself. If you want more true horror stories like this, stories that stay with you long after the video ends, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you want the next story, let me know by liking this video and sharing it with someone who understands why silence can be unsettling. This is Jake. Thank you for listening.